Sometimes people ask, how is it that people get sucked into cults like the Mormons or Islam or the Jehovah's Witnesses? Oftentimes it's simply because they've been raised in that environment and they don't know anything else. But there's a lot of other factors that figure into it. I mean, a lot of people that have been burnt by, say, a lot of the Hispanics come out of Catholicism, and they got burnt because they seen the problems with Catholicism, and so oftentimes they become an easy target for somebody that offers something else. They're looking for truth. They just don't know where to go to get it. And they may have some basic understanding of, the Christmas story and, baby Jesus and Mary and all that business. But when somebody comes along and says, well, the Bible is not reliable, it's been translated by, hundreds of people over the years, and because that's one of the first pitches that most of the cults will throw at them, especially the Muslims and the Mormons as well. But the problem is, in most cases, the people that are even presenting that argument, they don't know anything about Bible manuscripts. They don't know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls or any other New Testament manuscripts. And so they don't know anything about the church fathers and what they taught in the first 200 years of the church. But when somebody comes along and pretends to be a scholar and they quote a few Greek words, it's kind of easy to convince somebody that you know something. But, I mean, all you have to do is get a Strong's Concordance or a Vine's Expository, or now there's tons of stuff on the internet that you can tap into, and you can quote Greek words, and it sounds like you know something. But I like to, whenever somebody tries to impress me with their Greek, I like to ask them to recite the Greek alphabet for me, and 99% of the time they can't. And so that just shows how much Greek they really know. It's almost hilarious. But it's sometimes people marry into a situation, or they get involved in a cult for business reasons. Kind of like, people that get involved in the Rotary or the Elks Club or some other, organization like that has some camaraderie for business purposes. And so, and then, they'll get involved in a religion. They may not even believe in the religion, but they know that if they make friends with some of these people, there'll be business opportunities. And oftentimes in Islam, that's very much the reason people get involved in it. Because in a Muslim country, if you're not a Muslim, if it's a dominant, if it's predominantly Muslim controlled, if the government is Muslim, chances are if you're not a Muslim, you have to pay a demi tax or a special tax simply because you're not a Muslim. So to avoid that tax, oftentimes people get converted just to avoid the tax. And then other times, maybe a guy might get the hots for a Muslim gal, some woman that obviously their parents are not going to allow any kind of relationship unless he converts. And so, again, there's another easy way that people get sucked in to that type of thing. But the reality is, anything that contradicts the Bible in any way is a problem. But the problem is so many people don't know the Bible. They may think they know the Bible, and quite often you talk to people and they'll say, well, I've read the Bible. But if you begin to quiz them a little bit about it, they don't have a clue what's in the Bible. And the Muslims especially, most of the time they don't even know the Quran. They will pretend to know the Quran because they can quote a few surahs, a few verses, and then they might go to the mosque enough to where they've heard the imam preach a few sermons. But oftentimes what the imam preaches is purposely deceptive. And, the Quran, obviously, it attacks the Bible for everything from Well, Jesus is in the Bible, or in the Quran. There's no doubt about that. But it's a different Jesus. Even though it says he was born of a virgin and all that, when it comes right down to it, when it comes to the cross and the rest of the story, that's where things are all twisted around. And then the Quran as well, one of the problems with the Quran is, in the West, if you're looking at a book that's supposed to present the history of a religion or a people, usually it's in somewhat of a chronological order. But the Quran is not laid out that way. I mean, it's almost like they wrote a bunch of stuff and threw it up in the air and then stuck it all together, because it's just not chronologically written. And so you'll find things in the Quran about Moses. You'll find things about Jesus. However, one thing that you'll notice is you don't find much about the Old Testament minor prophets or even the major prophets, because when Israel fell apart after David's kingdom, after he died, Israel, the northern and southern kingdom, they split, right? And then it wasn't long before they came under judgment, and ended up, they went in under judgment into Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar came down, destroyed the temple, and carried off a lot of the Jewish people, usually the upper crust, carried them off to Babylon for 70 years. Okay, now one of the things that's interesting to me is in the Quran, there's a surah, there's a verse where it mentions Ezra. Now, Ezra, obviously, if you know the Bible, Ezra was one of the guys, along with Nehemiah, that came back to Israel after that 70-year period to rebuild the temple. Now, the way the Quran spells it out is that the whole scriptures had disappeared. There was none. They were all destroyed, blah, blah, blah. Now, there's no record of any of that Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, and a lot of those guys, they knew the scriptures. They grew up having to recite the scriptures. They had probably their bar mitzvah and all that business. So they were very familiar with the scriptures. And but the Quran makes it sound as though the scriptures totally just disappeared. But there was one guy named Ezra that had memorized the complete Old Testament. And he came back and recited it, and they rewrote it to preach to the Jewish people. I will just read a few verses out of the Quran here for you. This is out of Surah chapter 9, and starting at verse 29, it says, "Fight against those who believe not in Allah, nor in the last day, nor forbid that which has been forbidden by Allah and his messenger Muhammad, and those who acknowledge not the religion of truth," that is Islam, "among the people of the scripture," that is the Jews and Christians, "until they pay jizya," that's the tax I made reference to, "with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." Okay, so there's a purpose behind that tax. It's to put pressure on people, to force them to do things like convert, right? Now, this next verse is interesting. Verse 30 says, "The Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and the Christians say Messiah is the son of Allah. That is their saying with their mouths, resembling the sayings of those who disbelieved aforetime. Allah's curse be upon them, how they are deluded away from the truth." Now, there's no place in the Bible, in the Old Testament, which the Jews used as authoritative literature. There's no place where the Jews ever believed Ezra was the son of Allah. That's pure nonsense. But to add to the story, now this is the only real verse that I know of in the Quran that refers to Ezra by name. However, there's another verse that they like to use. It's in Surah 2, verse 259. Okay. Now, what the deal is here? They claim that when Ezra came back to the Holy Land, that he ran into a town that had been destroyed by an earthquake. Now, there's no record of this in the Bible, but this is what the Muslims will try to tell you. And, Ezra supposedly seen all these bones and all the ruins of this village, and he asks, "Oh, God, is there any way that you could raise these people from the dead?" Okay, now even though this verse does not mention Ezra by name, they apply it to Ezra. Now notice we were in chapter 9, now we're in chapter 2. So everything's kind of disjointed, but that's the way the Quran's written. So verse 259 says, "Or like the one who passed by a town, and it tumbled over its roofs. He said, 'Oh, how will Allah ever bring it to life after its death?' So Allah caused him to die for 100 years and then raise him up again. And he said, 'How long did you remain dead?' And he said, 'Perhaps I remained dead a day or part of a day.' And he said, 'Nay, you have remained dead for 100 years. Look at your food and your drink. They show no change. Look at your donkey. Thus we have made of you a sign for the people. Look at the bones, how we bring them together and clothe them with flesh.' When this was clearly shown to him, he said, 'I know now that Allah is able to do all things.'" Now they apply this story to Ezra and claim that he's the one that had this experience. But there's an interesting thing about this, because even though there's no record of any of this happening in the Bible, there's one whole chapter in the Quran. It's called The Cave. And it's a very similar story as this, because what it is, it's a story about some young guys who resisted the authority of the government, and they refused to believe in Allah, at least according to the Quran. And so they ended up hiding out in some caves, and then the local authorities rolled some stones over the cave. And these young guys, after several hundred years, somebody rolled the stones away and they sprang to life. And that's pretty much what the whole chapter of The Cave is about. So they dream up all kinds of wild stories like this that have no bearing on history. But see, if people don't know the Bible, they don't know any better, and they just go, "Wow, that's an amazing story." Well, it is an amazing story, but it's nonsense. It's not in the Bible. But see, that's the problem with a lot of people. They sit for hours listening to imams make claims to these kind of stories, claiming that they're Bible characters, Ezra, for example, but there's no bearing in truth here. I mean, they've got all kinds of stories about Old Testament characters that are twisted in a lot of ways. And if you look at the timeline of how they're written, they're all mixed up. Now, back to chapter 9, where I was reading from earlier. If you continue on in verse 31, it says, "The Jews and Christians took their rabbis and their monks to be their lords beside Allah by obeying them in things which they made lawful or unlawful according to their own desires, without being ordered by Allah. And they also took as their Lord the Messiah, the son of Maryam, while they, Jews and Christians, were commanded in the Torah and the Injil, or the Gospel, to worship none but Allah, or God. Praise be to him, far above is he from having partners they associate with him." So they, this is just basically an attack on the Christian authority of Old Testament and New Testament. And then there's an interesting quote down here at the bottom of the page from one of the hadiths out of Al-Bukhari, 29:26. Says, "The hour will not be established until you fight against the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. so kill him. Now, this is the kind of stuff you find in the Quran. And and people wonder why the Jews are having problems with Arabs and Muslims, right? And then the other interesting part is here the Muslims have built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on top of the foundation of the ancient Jewish temple foundation. And for centuries, only Muslims were allowed to go up there. So here they build a big monument on top of the foundation of the Jewish temple. And then they have the nerve to claim that the Jews are the occupiers. Okay? And here's another thought. Okay? The Quran mentions Jesus many, many times. However, if you really believe in Jesus, why don't they get baptized into Jesus? They don't. And they don't even know what baptism is about for the most part. If you talk to most of them, they don't have a clue what that's about. Now they might argue, well, they of course they argue against the Trinity. They can't wrap their mind around that a bit, that God can be both singular and plural. But yet, like in Genesis says, let us go down and make man in our image. You find the same kind of language in the Quran. Let us do that, and we did this, that, and the other, and it's speaking as though it's from God, right? So it's okay for them to use that kind of language, but if we use that kind of language, they accuse us of being a polytheist. So they have a kind of a twisted standard by which they make judgments.